A warship without fuel is not a warship. The arithmetic is simple and it is final. A guided missile destroyer operating in the Philippine Sea burns approximately 750 gallons of marine diesel per hour at standard transit speed, a consumption rate that, against the vessel's fuel capacity of approximately 500,000 gallons, produces an endurance figure that sounds generous until the operational reality of the Western Pacific erodes it. Extended patrols, storm avoidance routing, increased speed during tactical situations, the sustained operation of electronic systems, the helicopter's fuel draws. Each reduces the margin between current fuel state and the threshold below which a commanding officer's operational flexibility begins to constrain. Below 30% fuel state, discretionary speed becomes unavailable. Below 20%, tactical response options narrow. Below 15%, the ship becomes a presence in name only. Present, but unable to respond to anything that required more than the minimum fuel to reach a replenishment point. The people's liberation. Army-Navy's logistics doctrine had incorporated this arithmetic into its gray zone planning, not as a kinetic tool, not as an instrument for directly disabling a U.S. warship's propulsion, as a positioning tool. A U.S. warship that was managing its fuel state carefully, that had a scheduled replenishment rendezvous at a specific position and a specific time, was a warship whose movement was constrained by a geometry it had not chosen. The geometry of getting from where it was to where it needed to be before the fuel state reached the threshold that changed the operational calculus. If something occupied the space between the warship and its replenishment rendezvous, the warship had a problem that was not military, but was operationally real. At 6:14 a.m., the destroyer was 340 nautical miles east of the Philippine archipelago in the central Philippine Sea on a standard westbound patrol track at 14 knots. The fuel state was 34%, managed well through the preceding 48 hours of patrol operations, but scheduled for replenishment at a rendezvous point 180 nautical miles to the southwest, where a combat logistics force vessel was positioned and waiting. The rendezvous was scheduled for 1:30 p.m., 7 hours and 16 minutes from now at current speed, 180 nautical miles at 14 knots, 12 hours and 51 minutes. The scheduled rendezvous time and the transit time at current speed did not align. The destroyer needed to increase speed to approximately 17 knots to arrive at the rendezvous by 1:30 p.m., or the logistics vessel needed to move to a closer position, or the rendezvous time needed to adjust. This kind of scheduling arithmetic was routine for deployed naval vessels and was managed continuously through the Fleet Logistics Coordination System without drama. At 6:14 a.m., the coordination system produced a contact report that interrupted the routine. Bridge, CIC, 3 contacts bearing 228 degrees, ranges 28 to 34 nautical miles. Classification in progress. All 3 contacts moving. Courses approximately 010 to 045 degrees. Speed 8 to 11 knots. AIS active on all 3. 3 contacts at 28 to 34 nautical miles on the bearing that placed them between the destroyer and the replenishment rendezvous point, moving at 8 to 11 knots on courses that were taking them northward. into the route corridor between the destroyer's current position and the logistics vessel's holding position. The classification came at 6:17 a.m. AIS identification confirmed on all three contacts. Chinese People's Liberation, Army Navy auxiliary vessels, classification consistent with Type 904B combat store ship, one contact, and two Type 905 replenishment tankers. All three contacts, PLA, Navy auxiliaries, three PLAN logistics vessels, a combat store ship, and two replenishment tankers. Moving north into the corridor between the destroyer and its replenishment rendezvous at 8 to 11 knots. In the Philippine Sea, the captain arrived on the bridge at 6:19 a.m. He received the contact report in brief and stood at the radar repeater for 11 seconds, looking at the three blips and their course vectors, and running an arithmetic that did not require a calculator. The three planned auxiliaries were moving north at 8 to 11 knots. The destroyer's replenishment rendezvous was to the southwest at 180 nautical miles. The corridor between the destroyer's current position and the rendezvous point was being entered by three vessels whose presence there was not coincidental. AIS showing their destination. AIS destination data. All three show Philippine Sea operations. No specific port or waypoint. They are not declaring a specific destination. Philippine Sea operations. An open-ended AIS destination declaration that said nothing about where specifically they were going, and that was in the operational context of three planned logistics vessels moving northward into the specific corridor between a U.S. destroyer and its fuel source, saying everything by saying nothing. The cost of what was developing had two components that operated on different timelines. The immediate component, the destroyer's replenishment rendezvous at 1:30 p.m., was a scheduled coordination point that the Combat Logistics Force vessel had been holding for, that 7th Fleet Command had planned around, and that the destroyer's fuel state required within a specific window. Any delay to the rendezvous that pushed the replenishment beyond the early afternoon would cascade into the following day's patrol schedule and would affect the destroyer's availability for tasking during the window when its fuel state was constraining. The deferred component, if the plan auxiliaries succeeded in establishing a persistent presence in the replenishment corridor, the pattern would be repeated, not once, but as a sustained operation designed to demonstrate that U.S. Navy logistics in the Philippine Sea were vulnerable to non-kinetic interference that cost China approximately $4 million per day in fuel and crew time to maintain. 3 plan auxiliaries at approximately $120 million each in replacement value. $360 million deployed to test whether $360 million of positioning could produce an operational effect on a $2 billion U.S. destroyer's ability to maintain its assigned patrol. Quote 4, quote 5, 18 nautical miles for the closest contact. Not a proximity confrontation, a positioning confrontation. The plan auxiliaries were not going to close to 500 yards and challenge the destroyer physically. They were going to occupy the geometry of the replenishment corridor and force the destroyer to either route around them, adding distance and time and fuel to the transit, or proceed through their positions at a separation that the planned surveillance assets would document as a U.S. warship threading through a Chinese logistics formation on its way to an emergency replenishment. The framing of either option was unfavorable. Route around, the U.S. ship changes course because of Chinese positioning. Thread through. Footage of a U.S. warship navigating through Chinese naval vessels that the PLAN could present as evidence of Chinese maritime authority being exercised in the corridor. The first friction arrived at 6:24 a.m. from the Logistics Coordination System. The Combat Logistics Force vessel, the replenishment ship holding at the rendezvous point 180 nautical miles to the southwest, had been monitoring the situation since the contact report at 6:14 a.m. Its commanding officer transmitted to the destroyer's fleet coordination circuit. The replenishment ship could move its holding position northeastward toward the destroyer to reduce the destroyer's transit distance and potentially avoid the corridor that the planned auxiliaries were entering. Moving the replenishment ship approximately 40 nautical miles northeast would reduce the destroyer's replenishment transit from 180 nautical miles to 140 nautical miles and would place the new rendezvous point outside the corridor the planned auxiliaries were occupying. The replenishment ship moving toward the planned formation, a U.S. logistics vessel maneuvering in response to Chinese positioning. The replenishment ship's movement would be tracked on AIS, visible to satellite surveillance, and interpretable as a U.S. logistics adjustment made because Chinese vessels had occupied the original approach corridor. That was also unfavorable framing. The logistics coordination problem had no option. That produced an unambiguously clean picture. The captain received the replenishment ship's transmission at 6:24 a.m. He held it without responding for 4 minutes, looking at the radar picture, running the geometry against the fuel state, against the rendezvous schedule, against the cascade effects of any delay. At 6:28 a.m., he issued his first instruction, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 6, underscore, underscore. The engineering officer's calculation came at 6:30 a.m. at 19 knots for the next 7 hours to the rendezvous. Fuel state at arrival would be 26%, above the 20% threshold that meaningfully constrained operational options within the standard accepted margin for a planned replenishment. 19 knots was sustainable. It burned more fuel, but not catastrophically more, and it compressed the transit time enough that the rendezvous could occur at 1:30 p.m. on schedule if the destroyer began its approach to the rendezvous point at a higher speed than originally planned. 19 knots through a corridor that the planned auxiliaries were occupying was also a different proposition from 14 knots through the same corridor. At 19 knots, the destroyer would transit the planned positions at a speed that gave the planned auxiliaries very limited time to adjust their positions to complicate the passage. The three vessels at 8 to 11 knots had a maneuvering response available to a 14-knot transiting destroyer that was substantially reduced against a 19-knot approach. At 6:31 a.m., the Seahawk launched. The helicopter was not launched for the planned auxiliaries specifically. It was launched as a surveillance and documentation platform the same function it served in every gray zone encounter: to provide overhead coverage of the evolving geometry, to document the plan auxiliaries' positions and courses with the precision that airborne radar provided, and to transmit that documentation to 7th Fleet Command for the operational and diplomatic record that this encounter was building. The Seahawk climbed to 600 feet and established a track toward the lead planned contact. Alpha, the combat stores ship, at 26 nautical miles on the corridor bearing. At 600 feet and 140 knots, the helicopter reached a position from which its radar could paint all 3 planned contacts simultaneously within 4 minutes of launch. Underscore, quote underscore 7, underscore, coordinated movement. Not 3 planned logistics vessels that happened to be in the Philippine Sea on unrelated schedules. 3 vessels on coordinated courses at coordinated speeds, entering the replenishment corridor in a formation that had been designed rather than arrived at by accident. The second friction arrived at 6:37 a.m. from 7th Fleet Command. The encrypted circuit delivered a priority message. 7th Fleet was aware of the plan auxiliary presence in the replenishment corridor and was assessing the situation as a deliberate non-kinetic interference operation. 7th Fleet was consulting with NAVCENT and the Pacific Fleet staff on whether the plan auxiliaries positioning constituted an interference with freedom of navigation in international waters under UNCLOS, which guaranteed the right of innocent passage not just to warships, but to logistics vessels and to the operational formations that both categories of vessel comprised. 7th Fleet was requesting the commanding officer's tactical recommendation on how to proceed and was advising that the replenishment ship was on standby to execute any coordinate movement instructed. The message was not an order. It was a situation assessment and a request for recommendation, transmitted in the standard format of a fleet command that was managing the operational and political dimensions of a developing situation from a position outside the immediate picture. The captain drafted his response in 90 seconds. 3 options were available. Option 1, proceed at 19 knots on current course through the planned formation, accepting the visual geometry that produced, completing the replenishment on schedule. Option 2, adjust rendezvous coordinates to a position east of the planned formation, adding approximately 30 nautical miles to the replenishment transit, accepting the implied course adjustment, completing replenishment approximately 90 minutes late. Option 3, request 7th Fleet Authority to formally communicate to planned maritime authorities that their vessel's positioning constituted interference with lawful U.S. Navy logistics operations, establishing a diplomatic record while proceeding at 19 knots on current course. His recommendation, Option 1, combined with Option 3, proceed at 19 knots. Simultaneously, initiate formal communication at the flag officer level through established U.S.-China military communication channels. The destroyer was not going to route around 3 auxiliary vessels. The destroyer was going to proceed on its planned logistics track and establish, through both its behavior and through formal communication, that the corridor was open. 7th Fleet's response came at 6:44 a.m. Proceed at 19 knots. Flag level communication initiated through established channels. Execute The destroyer increased speed at 6:45 a.m., 14 knots to 17 knots, then to 19 knots, over 3 minutes as the engineering plant came up. The increase was audible in the ship. The change in engine note, the increased vibration through the hull's structure, the subtle forward pitch as the bow rose slightly in response to the added propulsive force. At 19 knots, the geometry changed. Alpha was now at 19 nautical miles. The closing rate between the destroyer at 19 knots and Alpha at 10 knots, combined approach velocity of 29 knots, produced a time to the first planned contact, CPA, of approximately 39 minutes. 39 minutes until the destroyer passed through the corridor position Alpha was occupying. CPA to Alpha at current speeds, 14 nautical miles, time 39 minutes. 14 nautical miles was not a close-range confrontation. It was the geometry of passing through a corridor where another vessel was positioned. A passage geometry that, in ordinary maritime operations, was unremarkable. It was remarkable in the specific context of 3 plan auxiliaries whose coordinated positioning had been designed to make it remarkable. The plan auxiliaries' response to the speed increase was visible in their course adjustments at 6:52 a.m. Alpha altered course from 025 degrees to 010 degrees, a 15-degree adjustment to the north that, at Alpha's speed of 10 knots, moved its projected position slightly to the left of the corridor centerline. Beta adjusted similarly. Gamma, the trailing vessel, held its original course briefly before also adjusting northward. The adjustments were small. They did not take the plan auxiliaries out of the corridor. They were repositioning within it, adjusting their formation geometry to accommodate the destroyer's higher approach speed. A formation that had been designed for a 14-knot transiting destroyer was now adapting to a 19-knot transiting destroyer, and the adaptation required course adjustments that the Seahawk was documenting in real time. Quote, 912 nautical miles. The plan auxiliaries were adjusting, but they were not departing the corridor. They were repositioning within it, tightening their formation, moving their courses slightly to open the passage geometry without abandoning the corridor position. The helmsman had been on course since 6:45 a.m. at 19 knots, a speed he had not held since the last high-speed transit drill, a speed at which the Philippine Sea's moderate swell produced a different physical experience at the helm than the 14-knot transit pace. The ship moved differently at 19 knots. The bow cut through the swell rather than riding it. The spray pattern off the forward hull was different. The steering required slightly more input to hold heading against the increased hydrodynamic forces. He held the heading. The course was 228 degrees, and the speed was 19 knots, and the 3 planned contacts were at 18 nautical miles on the same bearing and getting closer. At 7:04 a.m., the flag-level communication through established U.S.-China military channels produced a result. Not a response from the plan. The communication channels that existed between U.S. and Chinese military establishments at the flag officer level were formal, slow, and typically produced responses in hours rather than minutes. What the communication produced was a record. A formal U.S. military notification transmitted through established bilateral channels, that 3 planned naval auxiliary vessels were conducting coordinated positioning in a U.S. Navy logistics corridor in international waters, that this positioning was assessed as interference with lawful U.S. naval logistics operations, and that the United States expected the planned vessels to maneuver to allow the unimpeded exercise of freedom of navigation by U.S. naval vessels and their supporting logistics formation. The record existed. It had been created. Whatever happened in the next 25 minutes, the diplomatic record showed that the U.S. had formally communicated its position through the appropriate channels before the CPA event occurred. At 7:09 a.m., Alpha was at 11 nautical miles, Beta at 14 nautical miles, Gamma at 18 nautical miles. All 3 contacts still in the corridor. All 3 still on northward courses. CPA to Alpha, 11 nautical miles, 23 minutes. The captain stood at the bridge window. The Philippine Sea at 7:09 a.m. was clear. Good visibility, moderate swell, a sky that had passed through early morning gray to the blue-white clarity of a tropical Pacific morning. There was nothing visible at 11 nautical miles. The planned contacts were below the visible horizon from the bridge. They existed only on radar, in the CIC display, in the Seahawks data feed. They were abstractions at 11 nautical miles, abstractions that had real operational weight, but that did not yet have the specific physical presence that made maneuvering decisions feel urgent. The urgency was not physical. It was temporal. The fuel state, the replenishment schedule, the cascade effects of any delay. Those were the things that made 11 nautical miles feel close. At 7:17 a.m., Alpha changed course again. Not a small adjustment this time. A course change of 35 degrees, from 010 degrees to 045 degrees. That took Alpha from a northward heading to a northeastward heading. At 10 knots on a northeastward course, Alpha was no longer in the replenishment corridor. It was moving out of the corridor, away from the centerline, toward the corridor's eastern edge. Alpha, significant course change. Now 045 degrees. CPA, revised, 15 nautical miles. Alpha is moving out of the primary corridor's centerline. Beta followed at 7:19 a.m. Course adjustment from its northward heading to approximately 040 degrees. Also moving out of the centerline, also opening its CPA from the destroyer. Gamma at 7:21 a.m. Same pattern, same bearing eastward adjustment. All 3 planned auxiliaries were moving out of the replenishment corridor, not withdrawing from the Philippine Sea, moving to its eastern margin, maintaining their positions in the broader area while vacating the specific corridor geometry that their coordinated positioning had been designed to occupy. All 3 contacts, CPA opening, Alpha now 16 nautical miles and increasing, Beta and Gamma following. The captain received the update without expression. He looked at the radar for 8 seconds. The planned auxiliaries were repositioning. The flag-level communication, the 19-knot approach speed that had compressed the transit timeline, the Seahawks overhead documentation. Some combination of those elements had produced the course adjustments. Which element had been decisive was not determinable from the bridge. What was determinable was that the corridor was opening. Maintain 19 knots, replenishment on schedule for 1:30 p.m. The communication to the logistics vessel was simple. The rendezvous would occur as planned. The corridor was clear. The fuel state at the current 19-knot burn rate would reach 26% at the rendezvous, acceptable margin within planned parameters. At 7:29 a.m., the Seahawk updated its contact report. All three planned auxiliaries now at 19 to 24 nautical miles from the destroyer. Courses 040 to 050 degrees, moving eastward and northward, away from the replenishment approach track. The formation that had been occupying the corridor at 6:14 a.m. was no longer occupying it. The corridor was open. The replenishment rendezvous occurred at 1:27 p.m., 3 minutes early. The fuel transfer completed at 3:14 p.m. The destroyer returned to standard patrol speed at 3:16 p.m. Fuel state at 92%. Rendezvous completed. Schedule maintained. The helmsman from the 6:45 a.m. watch was off rotation by the time the replenishment completed. He had eaten lunch, completed a maintenance task on his assigned equipment, and was on his rack reading when the refueling finished. He did not know when it finished. He was not on watch. He had done his part of the job at 19 knots on a heading of 228 degrees through a corridor that was being occupied as he held it. The corridor had opened. The replenishment had happened. The fuel state was 92%. That was the whole of it. 3 planned Type 9, 04B, and Type 9, 05 auxiliaries. 53 minutes from first planned course adjustment to all contacts clear of the corridor. 11 nautical miles, minimum CPA to Alpha, before the planned course change. Flag level communication initiated at 6:44 a.m. Planned auxiliary course changes at 7:17 to 7:21 a.m. Replenishment completed on schedule. Fuel state 92%. 0 course deviations by the destroyer. Transit and replenishment completed as planned. The logistics geometry is the one that does not make footage. There is no proximity event, no close-range standoff, no visual of 2 warships at dangerous separation. There is a radar display with contacts at 11 nautical miles and a fuel state and a scheduled rendezvous time, and the operational reality that a warship that cannot reach its fuel source is not fully operational, regardless of what else is true about it. The plan understood this. They positioned to test it. The test produced a 19-knot approach, a flag-level communication, and a rendezvous that happened 3 minutes early. The corridor was open because the destroyer treated it as open, moved through it at the speed that demonstrated it was open, and documented everything that happened while it was doing so. That combination in the Philippine Sea, in the gray zone of logistics operations, was sufficient.